Well, hello again everybody. Welcome back to roof framing. This is a second part video of a two-part series. One's going to be on gable roof, and then this video is going to be on a hip roof. It's all about hip roof framing. So the apprentice is something like this, but a larger scale. This is a hip roof. So you can see that there's four equal slopes. And this section right here is the hip rafter. We got jack rafters right here. We got common rafters, ridge boards up here at the top, and then down here on the bottom we got the fascia. So in the classroom, what the apprentices are going to be learning, all the different mathematical examples of how to calculate the ridge board, mathematically how to calculate their hip rafter, and as well as the jack rafters. So in this video you're going to see how to calculate all those different measurements as for the theoretical, and as well as actual cuts for it. Also, you're going to be seeing the apprentices actually building their projects. So let's go ahead and we'll get started and we'll take a look at the plans. Here is the plans for the apprentices are going to have. They did the gable roof right here, and then they're going to modify this roof to take into account for a hip roof. So here's the hip roof. As you can see right here, the dimensions again we're going to have as the 16 foot is for the 2-foot walls. Reason for 2-foot walls is for safety in the classroom. This is about roof framing. It's not about wall framing and that sort of thing. 16 foot is the length, 8 foot is the width. So here, this 8 foot, they're going to be using half of that 4 foot is their run. When they go to use their tails, as it says right in here, you're going to have a 12-inch overhang. So when you're calculating with the tail for this hip roof, you're going to be using this 12-inch run as well as the 4-inch on your span. 4 foot for your span. So it'd be 4 foot plus 12 inches, that equals 5 feet. You calculate using that as your run when you're using your overall hip with tail, as well as your commons with tails. The apprentices got to calculate the ridge length, the hip rafter length, hip rafter with tail, roof area, 4x8 roof decking, and that sort of thing. So just some of the things that they calculate in the classroom. Each apprentice has to have their own pitch. So this is kind of an indicator on a set of plans. Let's say mine, for example, will be a 7-inch pitch. So for every 12 inches of run, it rises 7 inches. And that's what that means. And this is just one example architects put on a set of plans. Next page. So here's the next page. Kind of a cross section of the roof. So you're going to have a king common, some jacks. Again, this total span is 8 feet. Half of that, what they're going to use mathematically on their Construction Master calculator, is their run. And then a hip valley button on their calculator, you're going to be using that hip valley with a 4-foot run from your height above plate mark, your plumb cut, to your plumb cut at the top. And we're going to go over all of the different carpenter skills that you got to take into account when measuring for and marking for your hip rafter. Separate part, you're going to be also mathematically calculating with me a jack rafter. So just how those cuts go in and that sort of thing. Up at the top, as long as the layout's been done right, in this example, here's your ridge, okay? Mathematically, the intersection of all this ridge is going to be the center of each component. Here's a common rafter, your ridge, your king common rafter, your hip. So everything goes right into this point right here. That's your measurement. That's mathematically what it'll show on your calculator. So everything has to get shortened back half a diagonal distance. Separate videos, you see your commons that come in square are shortened by half the thickness of the material. king common, shorten half the thickness, okay? Hips, anything that comes at a diagonal is half a diagonal thickness. So you'll see that when we get to it. So let's go ahead and get started. Here you can see the apprentices are demoing out a section of their gable roof in preparation for a hip roof. It's easiest if you started with a hip roof to post up that ridge so that you can accommodate for the hip rafter tying into the ridge. All right, so this is gonna be a how to lay out and cut a hip rafter, okay? Some things to note is that this hip rafter is coming in at a 45-degree angle, okay? The theoretical is what our calculator is going to give us, and it's going to be right to the center of the ridge, just like this, okay? So keep note that we have to shorten, since this hip rafter can't physically be in the center, we're going to have to shorten it half the diagonal thickness of this ridge, okay? So let's walk over here to our hip. According to what our plans show, we're going to be using a 2x6 for our hip, okay? All right, first off, we're going to find the center of our hip. It's going to be right here. We got 1.5 inches, so I'm marking 3/4 of an inch, right like that. From this point, since it goes right into the corner at a 45, I'm going to mark 45 degrees on each side, right like, so be right here, rolling over the edge, right there. Okay, my pitch, the 7-inch pitch, so I'm not using the common since we've got a hip. We're jumping now over here to the hip. I'm using a 7 straight down, nice sharp pencil, right like that. Before I leave this position, because we have to shorten it by half the diagonal thickness, in this case, we're going to shorten it by 1 1/16 of an inch. Right, square on this side, not measuring down on the slope. It's a horizontal measurement. Okay. Again, with our pitch of 7, right like that. Back up to the top. Like that, rolling it back over, plumbing this side down, right here, and we got a hip valley, 7, like that, and then shorten this side by 1 1/16, hip valley, like this, right like that, okay? This will be my cut edge. This is my measurement. So this is my theoretical. So using our Construction Master calculator, we're gonna get two things. We got a hip rafter with tail and hip rafter without the tail. Without the tail will be to our crow's foot. Okay, so on our calculator, we're gonna use 4 foot as our run, just for our project. It's half the span, a 7-inch pitch, and then our hip valley. 6 foot 1 7/16. Measuring down, 6 foot 1 7/16. Right like that, okay? This point is the outside corner of your project, okay? So in this case, I'm gonna square across, okay? And then we're gonna plumb down, just like we did for the top. We got a hip valley, then our HAP, our height above plate for everyone is 2 3/4 of an inch. We got right there. I'm going to square that across. Try to be as accurate as you can on this one. It makes a big difference on that. Okay? Can you pause that? All right, so for a hip rafter, you can do one of two things. You can bevel it or chamfer it on the corner, or you drop a hip. You have to drop a hip or bevel it so that it's out of the way of the plane of the plywood. Okay, so in this case, I'll show you how much to drop it. On a hip rafter, how long is the unit run for a 7-inch rise?
12 inches.
No, not 12
17 inches.
17. So I'm going to do 17 right here. 7-inch. 17. Well, I can actually do it right there, which is what that should be. So 17, draw a line. Okay. Then I'm going to measure across half my thickness of my hip. So coming across, I'm going to mark 3/4 right there. And that distance from this edge to this edge square is how much you drop it. So in this case, I'm going to drop it 1/4 inch, 5/16. Okay. In order to drop it, here's my hip. Do I measure up or do I measure down?
Measure up.
You measure up.
Yeah.
Drop it. So almost 5/16. And I like to mark both to make sure that I did it. So this one, this is where I'm going to cut. This was my half, height above plate. Okay. Okay, now that takes care of this. So I just dropped my hip. Now I got to work on the tail on the end. Okay, for the tail, I'm going to have a different measurement. So my run is 4 foot and my overhang is how much? 12 inches?
12 inches.
Okay, so we're going to use a 5-foot run, 7-inch. Whoops. 5-foot run, 7-inch pitch. Now a hip valley. Okay. 7 foot 7 and 13/16. You know, measure right on the end. 7 foot 7 and 13/16. 13/16, right there. Can you hold that, Rodolfo? All right. I need the center of my board on this one. Center. I'm gonna mark 3/4. So let's go over here for a second. I'll show you what it should look like. Here's the skip markup. Down here on the end, as the fascia comes around, I'm gonna have a little point on this end, similar to what's there. Okay? Except for it's gonna be pointing back towards the ridge. The plumb is still gonna be plumbed going the same direction. A couple other things is this board right here also needs to look like a 2x4 to match the tails of the columns. Okay? So let's go back over here. We mark the center. So I'm going to 45 back towards the ridge. Right like that. Rolling it on an edge. And this mark is to the outside of the fascia. So we have 7-inch pitch on the hip valley. Right like that. Couple things. I might as well just go ahead and mark it so it looks like a 2x4. Okay. Then I gotta shorten, come back towards the ridge, the thickness of my fascia. So on here, our fascia is 5/8 of an inch. Hip valley, 7 inch. I'm gonna roll it back up, 45. Okay, come back on this side, parallel with my marks at the top. 7 inch pitch. Come over 5/8 thickness of our fascia. If your fascia is thicker, then that'd be thicker as well. 7. And back up to the top. Okay, cutting this, measuring from, that's our theoretical. Same thing, know where you're cutting, know where you're measuring. Okay, any questions on this?
Right after the hip rafter demonstration, the apprentices immediately began laying out a hip rafter for their project. Here you can see them cutting, being careful with cutting with the skill saw since it wants to bind on that angle, the 45, and cutting it at an angle. Once the hip rafter is cut, it's time to install it. Just like you can see here with the apprentices, they're installing it, nailing it at the bottom, toe nailing it, and toe nailing it up at the top where the connection is.
All right, here's how you lay out for a jack rafter. Some things that you need to know is the center of this hip rafter. Okay, just like we got out here, center of our hip rafter. The jack rafter has a single side cut, and the dimension of this single side cut is going to this center of this hip rafter. Okay, so your measurements are going to be to here. Also, you got to shorten it half that diagonal thickness. Okay, so let's come over here. Let's get this started. All right, a couple things that you got to do first. You got to mark the center of your jack rafter. So I'm marking 3/4 of an inch right there. 3/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to make one single side cut. It'll be like this, right through the center. Okay. Since it's not a hip rafter, I'm going to use the common on my speed square. Right here, I'm going to use my common, and we're going to say a 7-inch pitch. 7-inch pitch. We got to shorten it by half the diagonal thickness, which is 1 1/16 in this case. Plumb that back up, 7, common. And then I'm gonna do a 45 back down. That's your side cut. Right like that. This is what you cut, this is what you measure from. On our construction master. All right. Our run for our project is 4-foot run with a 7-inch pitch. Our common rafter is diagonal. Our hip valley is the hip valley. And we got a jack. This is what we're doing is our jack button. 24-inch on center. So we're good on our centers because that's our spacing of our rafters. Press jack again. The incremental differences between jacks is that and then our jack number 1, which in our case we only have one jack, is 2 foot 3 and 13/16. So I'm going to measure from this center point, our theoretical, the center of our jack, 2 foot 3 and 13/16. right there. 2 foot 3, 13/16. From this point on, everything treated just like a common rafter. Square it over, plumbing down. So I got a 7. Mark your half. In our case was 2 3/4. 2 3/4. And I'm gonna square it across. Right like that. This gets cut out. I'm gonna cut it somewhere in here so my tails are long. Make sure your tails stay long. You'll snap a line later and trim it to the length.
Here are the apprentices right after the hip jack rafter demonstration. They begin their layout for their project. Get ready to cut it and get ready to install it. Here next, you're gonna see the apprentices are installing their jack rafters, hip jack rafters. It should be from center of common rafter to the center of the jack rafter. In this case, be 2 feet. If it's not, there could be a mistake or an error in the layout, but it should be 2 foot between the centers. That's the spacing of this project. If any other sort of spacing, it would be whatever that spacing should be. And the adjustments should also be made in your Construction Master calculator. Here next, you see after the hip jack rafters installed and the hip rafters installed, the tails are all cut to length after snapping a line. And then the fascia gets put on like you see here. A nice, clean, pretty miter down at the bottom, as well as the rough side of the fascia should be out. That tends to be the finish edge. Well, that's it for hip roof framing. I'll see you next time and be safe out there.